Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're going to explore 2nd gen Ryzen overclocking a little more closely with the Ryzen 5 2600X on the Asus ROG Crosshair 7 Hero. I do plan to do the same with the Ryzen 7 2700X, but for now we're going to focus on the cheaper 6-core part. Back when I first reviewed the Ryzen 5 2600X, I found when using the old-fashioned multiplier method for boosting the all-core frequency that it was only possible to increase the single-core performance by 2 to 3%. This overclock pushed all 6 cores to 4.2 GHz, and although the maximum boost clock for the single core is 4.2 GHz, we still saw a small performance increase, though I suspect this was down to the fact that no performance loss was seen when switching between cores throughout the workload. We did see a slightly better 4 to 5% boost for the core heavy workloads, but even that makes it difficult to justify the overclock, which does require upgraded cooling due to the increased thermal load and of course power draw. That said, there is an alternative way to overclock the Ryzen processors that offers better single-core performance, and Asus put together a document explaining this method about a month ago now. We found previously that most of the good quality 1st gen Ryzen parts could hit 4 GHz, but an all-core 4 GHz overclock often didn't net you any extra performance in lightly threaded workloads, and at times could even reduce performance. This is because XFR has the potential to push processors such as the Ryzen 5 1600X, Ryzen 7 1800X, and all the Threadripper models to 4.1 to 4.2 GHz for lightly threaded workloads. With the Ryzen 5 2600X capable of hitting 4.2 GHz and the Ryzen 7 2700X 4.3 GHz, overclocking all cores to 4 or 4.1 GHz can and likely will reduce performance, and as I found, 4.2 GHz offers very little in the way of extra performance for lightly threaded workloads. So rather than lock all cores at a designated frequency, Asus and other board makers are taking advantage of AMD's extended frequency range, or XFR version 2 technology, by pushing it to its limits using Precision Boost Overdrive. Now, I know hearing words and acronyms like XFR do get a bit confusing, and you will hear things like XFR 2 and Precision Boost 2, Precision Boost Override, or Overdrive, or PBO. And then on top of that, you have motherboard makers such as Asus that have their own marketing terms. Asus has attempted to somewhat simplify this method of overclocking, but there are still a few key steps involved. First up is the Performance Enhancer, which has a few options available. Level 1 and Level 2 operate within the AMD spec, so you want to ignore those and go straight for Level 3 while avoiding Level 4 unless you're an extreme overclocker using LN2. With the Performance Enhancer set to Level 3, you want to make sure the Core Performance Boost is also enabled. Then I strongly recommend manually setting the CPU core voltage, as the auto or offset modes wound my 2600 up to crazy high voltages, somewhere between 1.45 and 1.55 volts. I found my 2600X was perfectly stable at 1.4 volt, and going below that did cause the system to lock up using the Performance Enhancer Level 3 option. Finally, you can push things a little further by increasing the base clock, though be aware this will also overclock your memory using the synchronous mode, which you definitely want to use. This method though is likely going to be more effective for those using the Ryzen 7 2700X, and I was only able to achieve a base clock overclock of just a single megahertz, and as you might imagine, this only had a very minor impact on performance, so I'm going to ignore that option for the 2600X. So for testing, we do have a few games to check out, as almost everyone who has requested this video did ask that I look into how these various overclocking methods impact gaming performance. In total, there are 5 test configurations. For a baseline, we have the Ryzen 5 2600X unaltered using DDR4 2933 memory with the standard XMP settings. But rather than using the box cooler, the Corsair H150i Pro has been used, and I've used this closed loop cooler for all the testing in this video. Then we have the Ryzen 5 2600X with DDR4 3400 memory using the XMP settings, and then the same configuration again, but with the stilts timings enabled. Then we have the DDR4 3400 configuration with the stilts timings plus a 4.2 GHz all-core overclock using the standard multiplier method. And finally, a Precision Boost Overdrive overclock using the Performance Enhancer Level 3 option, and again DDR4 3400 memory with the stilts timings enabled. Alright, you got all that? Let's get to the results. Here's a look at the operating frequencies for the single and multi-threaded workloads for the various configurations. For the stock core configurations, so before we overclock the Ryzen processor, using the different memory configurations, we see a single core frequency of 4.2 GHz, with an all-core frequency of 4 GHz. Then our 4.2 GHz multiplier overclock resulted in a fixed 4.2 GHz operating clock speed for both the single and multi-threaded tests. Then finally, the Precision Boost Overdrive configuration pushed both the single and all-core workloads to a maximum stable operating frequency of 4.3 GHz. It would be possible to achieve this overclock using the multiplier method, but at idle the cores wouldn't drop down from 4.3 GHz. That being said, let's check out the power consumption figures. Stock, the Ryzen 5 2600 pushed total system consumption to 176 watts, and at idle consumed just 56 watts. The all-core 4.2 GHz overclocked pushed system consumption 15% higher, hitting 203 watts, which isn't that bad. That said, we will likely only see a very small increase in performance based on our previous benchmarks. The idle consumption only increased by 7%, which again isn't bad, especially given all cores are locked at 4.2 GHz. Because the Precision Boost Overdrive is pushing the 2600X to its limits in both the single and multi-threaded workloads, power consumption is similar to that of the multiplier overclock. Okay, so now we can take a look at the difference these overclocks make, at least in Cinebench R15. The 2600X paired with the DDR4 3400 memory using the Stilts timings produced a single core score of 174 points with a multi-threaded score of 1392 points. Manually overclocking the 2600X using the multiplier method improved the single core score by 2% and the multi-threaded score by 5%. So very much like what we saw in our day one review. The Precision Boost Overdrive configuration improved the single and multi-threaded scores by a further 2%, which makes sense given the CPU operating frequency has been increased by 2.4%. So what kind of impact does this have on gaming when not GPU limited? When testing with Far Cry 5, we see a mere 6% increase in frame time performance when going from the DDR4 3400 configuration with the improved timings to the 4.2 GHz all-core overclock. The Precision Boost Overdrive overclock, which pushed the core's 100 MHz higher, scored us an extra frame on average, with no increase seen for the 1% low result. We see much the same when testing with ARMA 3, both overclocking methods yield similar results, making them 4 to 6% faster than the stock core configuration using the tweaked memory. Lastly, here are some Fortnite results, and this title isn't as GPU limited as the previous two titles we looked at with the GTX 1080 Ti at 1080p. That said though, the overclocks did only provide 3 to 4% more performance. By far the biggest gain seen here can be found when tightening up the sub-memory timings. This was only a brief exploration video, but I think we covered everything we needed to with the Ryzen 5 2600X. The general consensus on launch day seemed to be that overclocking the X models wasn't worth the added power draw, heat, and of course investment, and while that certainly seems to be the case with the 2600X. The Ryzen 7 2700X should be a bit different as it has a higher single core operating frequency, and you'll be missing out on that when using the simple multiplier method, so that's something I certainly want to look into shortly. But for Ryzen 5 2600X owners, there really is little to be gained by overclocking, especially if you fine-tune those memory timings, which you really should. A step one for second gen Ryzen owners, and I suppose even first gen Ryzen owners, really is to lock down those memory timings, and we saw when not limited by the GPU, gamers stand to gain around 10% more performance just by tightening those sub timings. So rather than invest money in a fancy closed loop cooler, invest it in some Samsung B-die memory and look up how to fine tune that stuff. We do have a video on that, so go check that out. And that is going to do it for this one. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more content. If you appreciate the work we do here at Hardware Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.